had never planned on stepping onto another plane after my career as a pilot ended. I used to love flying, the freedom of it, the thrill of commanding a machine thousands of feet above the ground. But that all changed after the accident. The memory of it haunted me. Those final moments in the cockpit, the frantic calls to the tower, the malfunction that shouldn't have happened but did. I was grounded after that, not by any official decision but by my own fear, my own guilt. I left the life of a pilot behind and settled into something quieter, something where the only risks I faced were the everyday kind. But now, after years of avoiding it, I found myself once again in the confines of an airplane cabin, not as a pilot but as a passenger. My parents had called me, their voices urgent over the phone, saying they needed to see me, saying it was important. They hadn't gone into detail, and maybe that was for the best. I bought a ticket on a late-night flight, trying to push aside the rising anxiety in my chest. The flight was a short one, just a couple of hours, and I tried to tell myself that nothing could happen. I wasn't flying the plane, I was just along for the ride. Still, as the engines roared to life and the plane started its ascent, a familiar unease settled over me. I glanced around at the other passengers, a full flight of tired faces illuminated by the dim overhead lights. The hum of the engines became a kind of background noise, and I tried to settle into my seat, closing my eyes for a moment. It was then that the turbulence hit. At first, it was the mild kind, the kind I had felt hundreds of times before. But then it grew worse. The plane shook violently, and I gripped the armrests, old instincts flaring up. I opened my eyes just in time to see the lights flicker, once, twice, and then go out. For a second, the cabin was bathed in complete darkness, and when the lights came back on, I realized with a growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. The seats around me were empty. Every passenger, every flight attendant, every single soul on the plane was gone. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, my mind racing through a dozen explanations, but none of them made any sense. I stood up, the plane eerily silent except for the hum of the engines and the faint rattle of turbulence still rocking the fuselage. I stumbled into the aisle, peering into the rows ahead and behind me, calling out, but there was no response. The emptiness was suffocating. I felt like I had walked into a nightmare, one where logic had no place. Then I saw it. There, taped to the seat in front of me, was a piece of paper. I pulled it off, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a rush. It was a list of rules, and each one made my stomach turn. 1. If the seatbelt sign turns on, do not unbuckle. 2. Never press the flight attendant call button. If you do, someone will answer, but it won't be a flight attendant. It will be a demon. 3. If the captain's voice speaks over the intercom, do not respond to any questions. He isn't a person anymore. 4. If you hear a baby crying, you must find the source immediately. If you don't, the witch will come for you. 5. If the plane descends without warning, stay seated and close your eyes. Opening your eyes will reveal a different landscape outside. One where the sky is blood red, and there are creatures flying alongside the plane. My heart pounded in my chest as I read over the list again and again, trying to process what it was telling me. Demons? A witch? Creatures in the sky? This had to be some kind of sick joke, some prank that was being pulled on me. But as I looked around at the empty cabin, a cold chill ran down my spine. Something was very wrong. I sat back down, the paper crumpled in my hand, trying to control my breathing. My rational mind told me that none of this could be real, but another part of me, The part that had experienced things going horribly wrong in the sky before wasn't so sure. I checked the seatbelt sign. It was off, but my eyes kept darting toward it, my hands twitching as I remembered the first rule. If the seatbelt sign turns on, do not unbuckle. I swallowed hard, feeling a trickle of sweat run down the back of my neck. The plane continued to shake with turbulence, but it was the silence that was getting to me, the complete and utter absence of any other living soul. I thought about the call button, glancing up at it. I wasn't foolish enough to test the rule. The thought of someone or something answering wasn't a risk I was willing to take. I shifted uncomfortably, the plane lurching as it hit another rough patch of air. That's when the seatbelt sign blinked on with a soft chime. My heart skipped a beat. I stared at the illuminated sign, my hand frozen over the buckle. The urge to unbuckle, to stand up and pace the aisle, was overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay seated. The rule was clear: do not unbuckle. I clenched my fists, knuckles turning white as the plane jolted violently. I felt like I was suffocating, trapped in a nightmare that was becoming more real by the second. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. Time had lost all meaning in the hollow, empty plane. The turbulence had finally started to calm, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Maybe the passengers would return, maybe the nightmare would end. But then, the sound of a baby crying echoed through the cabin. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I turned my head slowly, my eyes searching the empty rows, but there was no baby, just the soft, pitiful wail coming from somewhere, echoing in the stillness. The fourth rule flashed in my mind: if you hear a baby crying, you must find the source immediately. If you don't, the witch will come for you. My stomach churned as I stood, my legs feeling like they were made of lead. I moved slowly down the aisle, my eyes darting from row to row, searching for the source of the sound. The crying grew louder, sharper, as if the baby was in pain. My pulse quickened. I knew I had to find it, to stop the sound. But with each step, the dread grew stronger, the sense that I was walking into something far worse than I could have imagined. I reached the back of the plane, where the galley stood empty, the doors to the lavatories closed. The crying was coming from behind one of them, the door slightly ajar. My hands shook as I reached for the handle, every instinct in me screaming to stop, to turn back, but I couldn't. The rules were clear. I pulled the door open. The crying stopped. The small space inside was empty, just the dim light flickering weakly from the ceiling. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me for a split second before a cold gust of air swept through the cabin, extinguishing the light completely. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as I heard something, a faint rustling, like the sound of fabric brushing against metal. I spun around, but the cabin was still empty, though the air had grown heavy, oppressive. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but the only thing I could think of was the list of rules. I had followed them so far, but how long could I keep doing this? And what would happen if I broke just one of them? The baby's cry was gone, but the cabin felt more dangerous than ever. I stood there in the eerie silence, the hairs on the back of my neck still standing, my breath shallow as the oppressive weight of the cabin seemed to bear down on me. My mind raced, trying to grapple with the absurdity of it all. I couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep within me. The crying baby had vanished, but the memory of the sound lingered in the air, making me feel like I was teetering on the edge of something I couldn't quite comprehend. I returned to my seat, the list of rules clutched tightly in my hand, my mind cycling through them over and over, almost obsessively. What was going on here? Where had everyone gone? And more importantly, what was waiting for me if I broke any of these rules? I sank into the seat, my gaze flickering to the call button above me. The second rule haunted me: never press the flight attendant call button. If you do, someone will answer, but it won't be a flight attendant. It will be a demon. The thought sent a chill down my spine, but something inside me rebelled against it. What if this was all some sort of elaborate prank, a test of my endurance? Maybe none of it was real. My rational mind screamed for answers, demanding that I prove this situation was just some cruel trick. I needed to know if there was anything left of the world I knew, and the absurdity of demons and witches seemed like something out of a twisted nightmare, not reality. Without thinking, before I could stop myself, my hand shot up and pressed the call button. The soft chime echoed through the empty cabin, but almost immediately, I regretted it. My heart froze in my chest as I realized what I'd done. I had broken the rule. The seconds ticked by, each one heavier than the last, and then I heard it. A faint, shuffling sound from the back of the plane. My skin prickled, and my throat went dry. I turned slowly in my seat, my breath caught in my throat as I strained to hear. The sound grew louder, the unmistakable shuffle of footsteps making their way up the aisle, slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me. I gripped the armrests, my eyes darting to the list of rules. I had broken it. I had broken the second rule. My chest tightened, and I felt a rising urge to flee, to get away, but my body wouldn't move, frozen in place as the footsteps drew nearer. Then I saw her. A figure emerged from the shadows of the dim cabin lights, a flight attendant in maroon clothes, her uniform neat and pristine, but something was horribly wrong. She had no head. Her neck ended in a ragged, dark stump, the fabric of her uniform stained with old blood, and she moved with a slow, unsettling grace, her hands trembling slightly as she shuffled closer. She was whimpering, a soft, broken sound, like a trapped animal, and her headless form swayed with each step. My pulse quickened, my mind screaming at me to run, to hide, but I couldn't move. She was getting closer, her movements stiff, jerky, as if she was being forced forward by some unseen hand. I watched in horror as she reached the row behind mine, her headless body turning slightly as if sensing me, even though she had no eyes to see. I ducked instinctively, sliding down into the footwell in front of my seat, pressing myself as far back as I could go, my body shaking with fear. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as I clutched the sides of the seat above me, praying she wouldn't notice me. The whimpering grew louder, and I could hear the faint rustle of fabric as she passed by my row, her presence lingering just inches from where I was hidden. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to control the rising panic in my chest, willing myself to stay still, to remain silent. Every muscle in my body was tense, coiled like a spring, ready to bolt if I had to. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity, and I could hear her footsteps slow, her whimpering softening as if she was confused, unsure. I didn't dare open my eyes. I stayed crouched there in the footwell, barely breathing, waiting for her to move on. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of her footsteps started again, moving away, fading into the distance. I kept my eyes shut tight, my hands still gripping the seat in front of me, waiting until the sound of her shuffling disappeared entirely. When I finally opened my eyes, the cabin was silent once more. The oppressive weight in the air had lifted, but the fear still clung to me like a second skin. My muscles ached from the tension, and I slowly, carefully, pulled myself out of the footwell, my body shaking as I sat back in my seat. I had pressed the call button. I had broken the rule, but somehow I had managed to avoid whatever fate awaited me. The list of rules was crumpled in my hand, and I smoothed it out, staring at it as if it held all the answers. The other rules loomed large in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last. I couldn't afford to break any more. Whatever was happening on this plane, it wasn't just some sick prank. The rules were real and the consequences were real. I glanced around the empty cabin, the silence deafening, and my eyes locked onto the seatbelt sign above me. It was still on, glowing faintly in the dim light. The first rule flashed in my mind: if the seatbelt sign turns on, do not unbuckle. I swallowed hard, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the belt, making sure it was secure. The whimpering of the headless flight attendant still echoed in my ears, but I forced myself to focus on the rules, the only thing keeping me alive in this nightmare. I had no idea what would happen next, but I knew one thing for certain: I couldn't make another mistake. I sat back in my seat, still shaken, my fingers gripping the armrests so tightly they ached. The cabin was unnervingly still, every sound amplified in the silence. My shallow breathing, the faint hum of the plane's engines, the subtle creak of the overhead compartments. My mind replayed the image of the headless flight attendant in maroon, her whimpering, the way she had seemed to sense me even without a head. I couldn't shake it. The sound of her movements etched into my brain. As much as I wanted to calm down, to gather my thoughts, the oppressive stillness around me kept me on edge. My hands still trembled, and I fought the overwhelming urge to stand up, to move, to do anything to break the tension that hung in the air. But I couldn't move. I knew now that any action could trigger another rule, another consequence. That list, those rules, had proven themselves to be horrifyingly real, and I couldn't risk another mistake. My eyes darted nervously around the cabin, every detail of the empty plane now taking on an ominous significance. The rows of vacant seats stretched endlessly in front of me, each one perfectly aligned, untouched, but somehow filled with an invisible presence that weighed down the atmosphere. There was no one else here, no passengers, no crew, just the ghost of something wrong, something terribly wrong. I could feel it. I knew, deep in my gut, that I wasn't truly alone, even if I couldn't see anyone. My stomach churned as I glanced toward the window beside me. The thin barrier between me and the outside world felt fragile, almost non-existent, and the idea of seeing something out there, something unnatural, sent a jolt of fear through me. I snapped my gaze away from the window, my heart pounding. The plane suddenly jolted again, a violent tremor shaking the cabin, and my body lurched forward, my seatbelt straining against my chest. The turbulence had returned, more aggressive this time, and the plane rocked side to side, the sound of metal groaning somewhere deep in the structure. I clenched the armrests tighter, trying to steady my breathing. The lights flickered overhead, casting harsh flashes of brightness that only added to the disorientation. My mind raced, and I glanced upward, instinctively looking for the captain's voice over the intercom. But the speaker remained silent, and I remembered the third rule: if the captain speaks, do not respond. I wasn't sure if I was relieved or more terrified by the silence. My attention snapped back to the seatbelt sign, still glowing dimly in front of me. I checked again, making sure I was still buckled, still obeying the first rule. But then, something strange happened. The lights on the ceiling flickered again, longer this time, casting everything into an odd strobe-like effect, and in that moment, I felt a presence. Not in the form of shadows, not something lurking behind me, but a palpable pressure in the air, like being underwater, deep in the crushing blackness of an abyss. It made it hard to breathe, hard to think, as if the plane itself was suffocating me. The hairs on my arms stood on end, and my skin felt cold, clammy, as the pressure around me thickened. I needed to focus, I told myself, clutching the list of rules. I had to keep these steps clear in my mind, no matter what. As the plane continued to rattle and groan under the assault of turbulence, another sound began to creep through the chaos. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rumbling engines and shaking fuselage, but it grew steadily louder, a baby's cry. The sound was unmistakable, piercing through the noise with an eerie clarity that made my blood run cold. My heart skipped a beat as I remembered the fourth rule. If you hear a baby crying, you must find the source immediately, or the witch will come for you. The cry grew louder, echoing down the aisle, filling the empty space with its haunting wail. Panic surged through me, my eyes wide as I scanned the rows of seats, desperately searching for the source of the sound. But the cabin was empty. How was there a baby crying? Where was it coming from? My hands shook as I unbuckled my seatbelt, knowing that staying put would doom me. I had to find the baby. I had no choice. The rule was clear. I stood up, my legs weak and unsteady beneath me as the plane jolted again. The crying seemed to echo from all directions, bouncing off the walls of the cabin, disorienting me. I stumbled forward, gripping the backs of the seats for balance, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Every instinct in me screamed to sit back down, to hide, but I couldn't. I had to find it. The sound was becoming unbearable, more intense, as if the baby was in pain. I could hear it, the faint hiccups of breath between the wails, the sheer desperation in the sound. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat sending a wave of dread through me. As I moved further down the aisle, something odd caught my eye. The seats seemed to shift slightly, not physically, but in the way they appeared. It was subtle at first, but the further I went, the more distorted everything became. The rows of seats, which had seemed perfectly normal before, now appeared slightly off-kilter, as if the space itself was warping. The crying was coming from somewhere ahead, but I couldn't pinpoint it. I picked up my pace, my heart thudding in my ears. The pressure around me was suffocating now, and I could feel a cold sweat forming on my brow. The baby's cry grew louder, more urgent, and then, just as I passed one particular row, I saw something that made my stomach lurch. In the seat ahead of me, where moments before there had been only empty space, there was now a bundle, swaddled in a white cloth, rocking gently. The baby, it was right there, its tiny face just visible under the blanket, red and scrunched from crying. I hesitated, dread creeping up my spine, but the rule was clear. I had to approach. I leaned in slowly, cautiously, every nerve in my body on high alert. But as I drew closer, something shifted. The air around the bundle felt wrong, colder, denser, and the faint scent of something foul hit me, like decaying flesh. I recoiled slightly, my instincts screaming at me to get away, but I couldn't ignore the rule. I had to confirm the baby's presence. I bent down, my hand trembling as I reached toward the bundle, my breath catching in my throat. My hand hovered over the bundle, my fingers trembling, as I stared at the swaddled form in front of me. The baby's cries had become less frequent, more like soft whimpers now, but the air around it felt thick, as though it was charged with some dark energy. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to back away, to turn and run, but I was paralyzed by the weight of the rule. I had found the baby. If I didn't acknowledge it, something worse would come for me. My fingers brushed the edge of the blanket, and the moment I made contact, a sharp chill shot up my arm, freezing me in place. The fabric felt wet, damp with something I couldn't see, and a rancid odor filled the air, making me gag. I forced myself to lean closer, hoping to confirm that this was just a baby, hoping that maybe this nightmare would end if I followed the rules. But as I peeled back the corner of the blanket, my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't a baby at all. What lay beneath the cloth was something grotesque, a mockery of life. Its skin was gray and mottled, like rotting flesh, and its face was twisted, more animal than human, with sharp, jagged teeth where its mouth should have been. Its eyes were black voids, staring up at me, unblinking. A grotesque gurgling sound came from its throat, a sound that made my blood freeze. I jerked back in horror, my hand shaking as I stumbled away from the seat. The bundle rocked slightly as if it was alive, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it any longer. My pulse raced, and I felt my stomach twist in knots while rising in my throat. This creature had replaced the crying baby, and I had no idea what that meant for me. But before I could think any further, the plane gave a violent lurch, throwing me against the seat in front of me. My body slammed into it, knocking the wind from my lungs as I struggled to stay on my feet. The turbulence had returned, more vicious this time, and the entire cabin rattled as if the plane itself was tearing apart. I braced myself against the seat, my breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. I needed to sit down to regain control, but the sight of that thing in the blanket had left me shaken to my core. I turned, trying to make my way back to my seat, when the plane jolted again, throwing me to the floor. My hands hit the cold metal, and for a moment, everything felt disoriented, spinning. The lights overhead flickered once more, plunging the cabin into brief moments of darkness. And in those flashes, I saw something else. A figure at the far end of the aisle, standing perfectly still. My heart pounded in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out what it was. The lights flickered again, and I saw it more clearly, tall, with long limbs and an almost human-like shape, but distorted, unnatural. It stood there, unmoving, its gaze locked on me, though I couldn't make out any features on its face. The moments stretched on as the turbulence continued to rock the plane, and my pulse quickened. I scrambled back to my feet, my body trembling as I forced myself to move toward my seat. I didn't know what that thing was, but I couldn't stay out in the open. I stumbled into my row, collapsing into the seat, frantically buckling my seatbelt. I pressed myself back against the chair, glancing frantically at the rules in my hand, trying to make sense of everything. I had found the baby or whatever had replaced it, so I hadn't broken that rule. But now there was something else, a figure that hadn't been mentioned. It didn't move, didn't react as I sat there, staring down the aisle, but I knew it was watching. The pressure in the air had returned, suffocating me, and I gripped the armrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. The plane shook again, more violently this time, and the lights flickered once more. In the brief moment of darkness, I heard something, a soft whisper, carried on the stale air. It was faint, almost too faint to hear, but unmistakable. "Don't look." The voice wasn't the captain's, thankfully, but it was coming from somewhere. My heart raced as I realized the figure at the end of the aisle had moved. It was closer now, just a few rows away, its tall form distorted in the flickering light. I shut my eyes, my hands trembling as I clutched the seat. Couldn't look at it. The plane rattled again, and the sensation of being watched intensified. My skin prickled as if something cold had brushed against it, but I refused to open my eyes. The rules were clear. I couldn't afford to make another mistake. The turbulence subsided for a moment, giving me a chance to breathe, but the sense of danger lingered in the air. Slowly, I opened my eyes again, scanning the cabin. The figure had vanished, but the unease remained, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I looked down at the list, forcing myself to focus. The rules were the only thing keeping me grounded, the only thing that made sense in this twisted reality. I glanced up at the seatbelt sign again, still glowing faintly, a constant reminder of the first rule. But my attention was pulled back to the intercom above. A static crackle filled the cabin, and my blood ran cold. The captain's voice. "This is your captain speaking," the voice said, its tone unnervingly calm. "We seem to be experiencing some unusual turbulence. Please remain seated, and everything will be fine." My heart pounded in my chest as the third rule flashed in my mind. If the captain's voice speaks over the intercom, do not respond to any questions. I squeezed my eyes shut again, my hands trembling as I waited for the voice to continue, for the trap to be set. "You there in row 12, the voice said, far too specific, far too directed. "Everything all right? Would you like to come up to the cockpit? It's safe here. Just unbuckle your seatbelt, and I'll guide you." My pulse quickened, and I could feel sweat forming on my forehead. I gritted my teeth, resisting the urge to respond, resisting the urge to look around. The voice didn't stop. "I know you're listening. You don't have to be afraid. Just unbuckle and I'll explain everything. Come on, it's the only way out." My breath came in short, panicked bursts as the plane shook again, but I held firm, refusing to answer, refusing to acknowledge the voice. The static on the intercom grew louder, distorting the captain's voice into something more inhuman, more guttural. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice cut off. The cabin fell silent once again. I opened my eyes cautiously, my hands still gripping the seatbelt, and I let out a shaky breath. I had resisted, but the game wasn't over yet. Something worse was coming. I could feel it. I glanced out the window again, the fear of seeing something unnatural gnawing at me, but I forced myself to look. The sky outside was dark, endless, but for now, at least, it seemed normal. I knew better than to trust appearances. The rules were the only truth I had. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the next horrific event to unfold. My eyes darted to the list of rules, reading and rereading them as if memorizing them would somehow keep me safe from whatever lurked in the dark corners of the plane. The silence was almost worse than the chaos. It weighed heavily on my chest, every breath feeling like a struggle as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I had followed the rules so far, and somehow I was still alive, but the dread never left. The tension in the air was unbearable. I had no idea how much time had passed, minutes, hours. It all blurred together. My mind was a haze of fear and adrenaline. I kept replaying the sequence of events in my head, every mistake, every close call, wondering how much longer I could survive this nightmare. The plane lurched violently again, pulling me back to reality. The overhead lights flickered, dimming, then flaring back on, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow. The seatbelt sign was still on, but I couldn't sit here any longer. I had to move, My legs felt like lead, but I unbuckled the seatbelt slowly, cautiously, as if the slightest sound might provoke the horrors that stalked this cursed flight. I stood, unsteady on my feet, and the floor beneath me swayed as the plane jolted once more. My knees buckled, and I clutched at the seats for support, trying to steady myself. I needed to make it to the front. Maybe there was some explanation, anything to make sense of what had happened. The turbulence worsened, the whole plane shaking violently, as if some unseen force was trying to rip it apart. I stumbled down the aisle, my body being tossed from side to side, every step a battle to keep my balance. My head pounded, and the air felt thin, almost suffocating. I tried to move faster, desperate to reach the front of the cabin, but the floor tilted beneath me as another violent jolt threw me off my feet. My body crashed to the floor, my head slamming into the metal edge of a seat. Pain exploded behind my eyes, a sharp, searing sensation that radiated through my skull. My vision blurred, and everything began to spin. I tried to get up, tried to move, but my limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, like I was sinking deeper into some inescapable void. Darkness crept in from the edges of my vision, swallowing the flickering lights, the seats, the aisle, until there was nothing left. I could still hear the faint roar of the engines, the turbulence shaking the plane, but even that sound began to fade, replaced by a deep, oppressive silence. I was drifting, falling, as everything around me disappeared. I had no idea how long I was out. When I opened my eyes again, the harsh, sterile light of a hospital room greeted me. I blinked, disoriented, the beeping of a heart monitor somewhere to my right cutting through the grogginess clouding my thoughts. My body ached, and my head throbbed with a dull pain, but I was alive. I tried to sit up, but the effort sent a wave of nausea through me, and I collapsed back against the pillow. "Take it easy," a voice said gently. I turned my head, wincing at the sharp pain in my neck. A nurse stood by my bedside, her face kind but serious. "You've been through quite an ordeal." My throat was dry, and I swallowed, struggling to find my voice. "What happened? How did I get here?" The nurse glanced at the chart in her hands, then back at me, her brow furrowing slightly. "You were found on the plane when it landed. You were the only person on board." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. The only person. I tried to make sense of it, but my mind was still foggy. "That's impossible," I muttered. There were others. There were passengers, a crew. The turbulence I saw. I trailed off, unable to put the horror I had witnessed into words. The nurse gave me a sympathetic smile, but there was something else in her eyes, something that made me feel like she wasn't telling me everything. "The plane landed safely," she said, her tone calm, matter of fact. "You were found unconscious in the aisle. There were no other passengers, no crew. The flight was listed as having only one occupant, you." I stared at her, my mind reeling, trying to process what she was saying. It didn't make sense. Couldn't make sense. I wanted to argue, to explain what I had seen, the rules, the things that had come after me, but the words wouldn't come. The nurse stepped closer, her voice softening. "It's okay," she said. "You're safe now. You've been through a traumatic experience, but you're going to be all right." I shook my head, disbelief and confusion swirling inside me. But the plane, the rules, I saw things that shouldn't have been there. She didn't respond, just gave me that same sympathetic smile, as if she'd heard it all before, as if she knew something I didn't. My mind raced, the events of the flight playing over and over in my head, but I couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that I had survived, somehow, and I was alive. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare wasn't truly over. The list of rules, the horrors I had encountered on that plane, they felt too real, too vivid to be a mere dream or hallucination. And if I was the only one on board, then where had everyone else gone? The nurse patted my arm gently before turning to leave the room. "Get some rest," she said softly. "The doctor will be in to check on you soon." As she walked out, I was left alone with my thoughts, the eerie silence of the hospital room closing in around me.